The Tyrolean Countess Margaret Maultasch. An example of inimitable ugliness. But contrary to public opinion, the Countess wasn't disgustingly ugly. How did it happen then she went down in history as a symbol of ugliness? The story started with a sketch made by Leonardo da Vinci in 1490, so more than 100 years after Margaret's death. The great Leonardo decided to experiment in painting and created a caricature image of an ugly old woman who had nothing to do with the ugliness of the Tyrolean Countess. He named his drawing The Old Woman's Head. In 1513, the Flemish artist Quentin Matsys used that sketch for his painting Portrait of an Ugly Woman in the grotesque style. And only in the 18th century the portrait of an ugly old woman was associated to Margaret Maultasch in an engraving made by Gilles de Marteau. At the beginning of the 20th century, a photographer from Murano used this image as a theme for a postcard. The portrait of the ugly Duchess Margaret Maultasch went around the world. In 1923, the German writer Leon Feuchtwanger dedicated his second historical novel to Margaret, The Ugly Duchess Margaret Maultasch, where he told quite correctly about the life of Margaret of Tyrol. But the appearance of the Countess was described as terrifying, because the writer relied on a painting by Quentin Matsys. What was this woman really like? What did she do in her life? How did she get the nickname Maultasch? Margaret was born in 1318 and was the only surviving child of her father, Henry of Gorizia, Duke of Carinthia, Count of Tyrol, and even King of Bohemia from 1307 to 1310. Her mother died when Margaret was 2 years old. The father's next wife could not give birth to an heir and was so weak in health that she didn't even live to her 21st birthday. So the girl turned out to be the sole heiress of the Tyrolean county, which was a small but independent state with its own laws, parliament, and army. At the age of 11, Margaret was married to the 7-year-old John Henry, the youngest son of the Bohemian king, John of Luxembourg. Margaret's marriage was supposed to end the enmity between the Luxembourgs and the rulers of Tyrol over the Bohemian crown. The young husband and wife didn't bother each other. She lived in the family estates of Tyrolean family. He accompanied his father on military campaigns. 5 years later, Margaret's father died, and wars for power over Tyrol began. Unfortunately, there was a treaty of 1282. According to that, Tyrol would pass into the possession of the Habsburgs, if there were no male heirs of the House of Gorizia. But the Habsburgs ruled both in Austria and in Bavaria. Both claimed Tyrolean possessions. After a small war, they finally came to an agreement and divided Tyrol among themselves. This didn't suit Margaret and the freedom-loving Tyrolean Highlanders at all. An 18-year-old girl made a fiery speech in the Landtag, the local parliament, and united all Tyroleans, both peasants and aristocrats. An uprising broke out. They demanded the return of power to the rightful heiress. Fighting with the Highlanders on their territory was an impossibly difficult task, and the Tyroleans won. Austrians and Bavarians were forced to leave the country and recognize Margaret as the ruler of Tyrol. Of course, she got a lot of enemies. But then, young Countess showed herself as an experienced politician when she got closer to neighboring Bavaria in contrast to the Austrians. This didn't suit her husband, John Henry, at all. His relatives were enemies with the Bavarian rulers. For the inhabitants of Tyrol, the young ruler reduced taxes. and the trade immediately flourished and new cities were built. Her husband, John Henry, wasn't allowed by Margaret to deal with the county administration. He had fun in the company of friends with drinking and women of easy virtue. Besides, he was scheming against his wife. But then, Margaret showed such miracles of emancipation which were simply amazing for the 14th century and shocked the medieval society. She decided that the marriage concluded in childhood didn't suit her and kicked her legal spouse out of the country. One day, John Henry returned from hunting and found himself in front of the closed gates of the castle. He had to spend several days without a roof over his head, because all the nobles of Tyrol refused to give shelter to him. Then, Margaret filed for divorce in Rome, using the fact that she and her husband were not in an actual marital relationship. In short, she declared him impotent. At that time, the girl was 23 years old. In the Middle Ages, only adultery, a large age difference, close relation, irresistible disgust, impotence, and lack of heirs were considered valid reasons for invalidating a marriage. The Pope didn't approve the divorce and insisted on preserving the marriage between Margaret and John Henry. But then, Louis IV, Holy Roman Emperor himself, declared Margaret's first marriage invalid. So, at the age of 25, Margaret ignored the Pope Clement VI ban and married the eldest son of the Holy Roman Emperor, Louis V Wittelsbach, who was 3 years older than she was. By the way, he was one of the most handsome men in Europe, and women adored him. So, this fact refutes rumors about Margaret's ugliness. He just couldn't marry an ugly woman. So, it was the first civil marriage in the European history, and it trembled on the Roman Church domination. Margaret and Louis were excommunicated from the church. Louis no longer could take his father's throne of the Holy Roman Empire. He lost the right to the crown and the throne. Tyrol was placed under interdict, that is, all religious services were prohibited. A defamation campaign started against Margaret. The first husband, extremely offended by the accusation of impotence, spread rumors that the reason for no marital relation was an irresistible disgust as a consequence of the ugliness and promiscuity of Margaret. Historians consider the second marriage of the Tyrolean Countess quite happy. The couple got along, helped each other in political matters. They had sons Hermann and Meinhard, but the first husband's relatives perceived the divorce as an incredible insult. In 1346, John Henry's brother, Charles of Luxembourg, became King of Bohemia and Roman-German king, and decided to reconquer the richest Tyrolean lands. He invaded the possessions of Margaret, ravaged 2 main cities of the county, and besieged the Tyrol castle. The siege of the castle was repelled by Margaret with a small army. Her husband Louis gathered a new army and ousted the invaders from the Tyrolean lands. Later, Charles of Luxembourg reconciled with Margaret and Louis. It took them many years and efforts to make the church and neighbors recognize the legitimacy of their marriage and children. In 1348, John Henry decided to remarry and asked the Pope for a divorce from Margaret. The former spouse also admitted that the marriage wasn't consummated, but denied accusations of impotence. So their divorce was finalized. However, Margaret and Louis were excommunicated from the church for another 10 years, and their marital union wasn't recognized by the papal cure for 10 years as well. In 1361, Margaret's husband, Louis V, died. Shortly before his death, his eldest son, Hermann, died. The co-ruler of the Tyrolean Countess became their second son Meinhard III, who died 2 years later, and the Tyrolean branch of the House of Gorizia ceased to exist. At the age of 45, our main character was left without support under severe pressure from Austrian rulers eager to absorb Tyrol. Countess Margaret yielded to Austrian pressure and ceded possession of Tyrol to Rudolf IV of Habsburg. The reason for abdication were special circumstances and weakness of the female sex. According to the condition of Rudolf IV, Margaret could no longer visit Tyrol. Thus, Tyrol lost its independence and became a part of the Austrian monarchy. Margaret spent the rest of her life at the Austrian court. In 1369, at the age of 51, she died in Vienna, in luxury but alone. One of the districts in Vienna was named after her, Margareten, and Tyrol is a part of Austria now. Margaret of Tyrol managed to cause trouble to many powerful people. So dirty gossip about the Tyrolean Countess were unstoppable. The legend of the ugly Countess swept the whole society. Everyone forgot about her fight for independence and prosperity of the County of Tyrol. Charles of Luxembourg was elected Holy Roman Emperor. The former husband, John Henry, remarried and became his brother's assistant in the affairs of the administration of Germany. And a woman who once had the courage to resist them was presented by her enemies as a monster. Artists and historians, to please the authorities, portray Margaret as an ugly old woman. According to the description of her contemporary, chronicler John of Winterthur, Margaret was a very beautiful woman, and in the picture on the first half of the 16th century she was shown as a very pretty woman. In the engraving of the end of the 16th century, Margaret looked like an ordinary woman. The only known lifetime image of Margaret of Tyrol was on her personal seal. We see a slim woman in a full height, but her features are hardly seen. And there is an image that could presumably be a lifetime portrait of Margaret of Tyrol. This is a fresco in the castle of the brothers of Bungang, and she doesn't look ugly on this portrait. In 1362, Margaret was mentioned in Habsburg's documents without any nickname. But in 1366, in the third Bavarian recension of the Saxon World Chronicle, she already had the nickname Maultasch, but the true origin of it remains unknown. Probably this nickname reflects a distorted mouth with a drooping lower lip, which look like Maltaschans. This is how dumplings are called in Swabian cuisine. There is also a meaning which can be translated as prostitute or vicious woman. That's how her political opponents and the church spoke about her. Humiliating descriptions of the Countess were found mainly in the works of Luxembourgish and Bohemian authors who wanted to please their authorities and showed a negative attitude to the events associated with the divorce from John Henry of Luxembourg and the second marriage with Louis of Wittelsbach. In fact, the only Margaret's fault was that she was ahead of her time, when women were engaged only in housework and didn't dare to revolt against men. Everything that Margaret did for the prosperity of Tyrol was forgotten and misrepresented. Only in the 20th century, when women began to fight for their rights, the history of Margaret of Tyrol was being revised. Do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this story. Oh, and click on the bell so you get notified when the new episode comes out.